now I'm going to share my screen. Lisa and Susan, please come back on screen. Can I get a thumbs up from my speakers if they could see the first slide? Excellent. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Welcome. AASHTO's Multi-State Transit Technical Assistance Program welcomes you to the first MTAP Technical Initiatives Forum 2021. My name is Richard Price and I am your lovely host today. And before we get started, as always, we'd like to thank our sponsors, AASHTO's premier and capital sponsors, AECOM, Bentley, HNTB, Jacobs, and WSP. Our capital sponsors are Amazon, American Concrete Pipe Association, Autodesk, and HDR. We are grateful for their sponsorships. And again, before we get started, just have some housekeeping items for the audience and all the participants. My first request is, even though we're using Zoom and Zoom meeting, and you have the option to turn on and off your mic and the option to turn on and off your video, I ask that you please keep your mic muted and your video off unless you are speaking. That doesn't include the panelists. Panelists, feel free to keep them on. Again, unless you're speaking or we're participating in the Q&A, I'm trying to minimize the technical glitches that occur when everybody has their microphones on and their video on. So thank you for that. Another question I want to answer in advance is that all of our documents and all the presentations will be posted online as well as the recording. It will be posted to the MTAP website. And for everybody, I will cut and paste that website right now into the chat. So please, if you don't have it bookmarked, please feel free. Because like I said, all the information will be posted to there. And lastly, speaking of chat, feel free to chat amongst yourselves, chat with the speakers, chat with other participants, send me a chat. That's the reason why we use Zoom meeting, is for the flexibility and because the ability to use the chat function as opposed to what Zoom webinar does not allow the function for chat. And of course, speaking of chat, let's start with the first chat from you to me. Please let's do a virtual roll call. Send me a chat and send me your name, send me your title, send me your organization, and tell me what about this particular meeting, this particular webinar, and this topic is of interest to you and why you're here. It could be anything, one sentence, not even. Just let us know. I think it just provides very interesting content for when I review the details later. So thank you for that. And next, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to introduce our moderator, Wiley Brooks of the Alabama Department of Transportation. Take it away, Wiley.
Hello, everyone. Glad to know that we have a large number of participants with us on this today. This is our first technical initiative forum for FY 2021. It's the topic for today is successful strategies for multimodal transit inclusion in statewide transportation planning. In the state of Alabama, the statewide planning process is seen as a opportunity to have high levels of assessments of the transportation systems that take care of our citizens and businesses in this state. And this gives the planners a chance to look at how well those systems are working to deliver for our state along the transportation routes that are plotted to be used. And I vision the multimodal transportation plan as where it's like a wheel with a cog and spokes, to where the center cog is transit. And from transit, it feeds the roads and bridges. It feeds the rail, aviation, ports, and the pedestrian and bicycles. And from this feeding, it is how the businesses get what's needed to run our state and its economy. And multimodal transportation planning is very important in building a good business system and building a good economy for our states. And therefore, transit must be included in that process. And I think today, the presenters that we will have will give us some ideas on how to successfully plan for that. So Richard, if you'll show the next slide that shows who our presenters are. Today we have with us Susan Pittman. She's a strategic investment manager for the Public Transportation Division of Oregon Department of Transportation. We have Lisa Radams, who is the principal transit planner of the Office of Transit and Active Transportation for the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and Grant Sparks, the manager of the transit planning and corridor development for the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. So I'm gonna allow them to come as they choose and introduce themselves any further, and so we can talk on our discussion. We'd like to encourage everyone that is on the Zoom today to ask questions, become involved. Let's not let this be a one-side conversation with our panelists, but we all get involved and maybe ask questions and have a good conversation about how multimodal transit planning can be included in the statewide planning process. With that, Susan, you first up.
I'll unmute myself, and then Richard, look, I'm gonna time myself, so you don't have to. All right, okay. So I'm here today, it's fitting that I'm the first one to go because I'm not getting into the details of the planning, but more on the front end of things in terms of money for planning and facilities and capital. I'm here to talk to you about the story of the STIP, the Public and Active Transportation Funding for our next STIP cycle, which is 2024 to 2027. We had a historic increase in funding, and that wasn't actually new funding, it was funding, a redistribution of funding, which I think is a little bit unusual when it comes to state DOT STIPs. So I wanted to kind of go through the background and set the stage for how we got there. Next slide. Before I do that, I'm from Oregon, or I live in Oregon, and so I had to post a photo of myself in a giant tree and my kid and wearing plaid. Wanted to give you a little context about me because I'm new to this group. And generally, I'm pretty new to public transportation. I've been working in active transportation since about 2004 and really understanding the connections to transit, but the specific details of the nuts and the bolts of the transit programs are really new to me because we just transitioned into a different division with a reorg with our organization. And so Marsha Hoskins, if you guys know her, Marsha is my boss. Next slide. So I just wanted, since you guys are state DOT folks, wanted to give you an understanding of kind of where the public transportation division fits within our state DOT structure. Next slide. And what do we do? So I mentioned Marsha Hoskins is my boss. She is the Policy and Strategic Investments Unit Manager, or actually I got that a little off, but we are in the unit that I am the lead over. We are the group that does the subject matter expertise in terms of public transportation, pedestrian, bicycle, and safe routes to school. So we're trying to create the efficiencies by bringing all those programs together. We're also the strategic funding focus. So we manage legislative and state funded programs, kind of just a general understanding of those levels. We have the statewide Transportation Improvement Fund, which is $100 million a year for transit operations. We also have about a 10 to 15 million a year allocation for safe routes to school infrastructure with a strong focus to access to transit in there. And then we also have some state gas tax dollars that are specified for pedestrian and bicycle improvements. Next slide. And so, as I said, I'm here because we just had a historic investment in public and active transportation. We had a nearly $100 million increase during that cycle, which is about 60%. So I moved from Chicago to Oregon, and I was kind of blown away by some of the difference in the numbers between how much money Chicago gets and how much money Illinois gets and how much money Oregon gets. And I will assure you, this is a lot of money for Oregon. We are a small state of about 3.7 million people, so it's a pretty significant increase. And the focus of these funds, looking at enhancing equity, multimodal travel options, and a strong focus on greenhouse gas reduction. Next slide, please. So this number is kind of a little hard from context standpoint, but we have a $255 million allocation. Next slide. So the foundational work, this is the meat that I wanted to get into. Next slide. So we've been doing a lot of planning work, specifically focused on our mode and topic plans over the last couple of years. And so, so the mode and topic plans have set a strong policy foundation for how we got to the $255 million allocation. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight a little bit out of the vision because this is really critical. We really focus on the travelers of all ages and ability and transportation options in our transportation options plan. Next slide. Again, you'll see this all ages, incomes, and abilities language, well-connected walking, biking routes, interconnected system. Next slide. And our public transportation plan vision included, again, interconnected, and then a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So these are our guiding lights for these plans and everything falling from there. Next slide. But plans don't always make action. And Oregon, in March of 2020, we had an executive order on climate action. And then our agency established a climate office at that time with a strong focus on reduction of vehicle miles traveled per capita, cleaner vehicles and fuels, and this is the big one, consider greenhouse gas emissions in decision-making. And so all this was really clearly laid out with the climate office priorities. Next slide. Our agency also underwent a strategic action planning process more recently ahead of the STIP decision with a focus on equity, sufficient funding, and a modern transportation system, which included kind of all of those policy priorities and the visions for an interconnected system for all ages and abilities. Next slide. So in our strategic outcomes, there is that focus on reduction of carbon footprint and then improving access to active and public transportation. So it's really strong emphasis as a guiding light. And the reason why I bring all these pieces up is because not one of these single pieces is going to get us to kind of a decision-making framework. It's almost as though all the arrows need to be pointed in the same direction. And so for the last 6 years, we've been having the arrows start getting aligned. Next slide. And so in that strategic action plan, we had a metrics that was blessed by the Oregon Transportation Commission, our decision-making body on our STIP funding, that by the end of 2023, we'd see an increase in the percentage of agency funding dedicated to projects and programs that improve equitable access to walking, biking, and transit. Next slide. And so this is where we got to the commission's decision on their funding allocation. Next slide. So we also went through a process. While we can get everything lined up with policies and plans and executive orders, we still need to have a lot of pressure from the public as well. There was public engagement around the STIP decision, and there was an overwhelming amount of support for increasing the public and active transportation funds. Specifically, there was an emphasis on decision-making around transportation funding that reduces our greenhouse gas emissions. There's also, so that focus on the climate and social equity were critical in terms of pressure on our Transportation Commission. Next slide. And so I just wanted to say, I already said this, that our Oregon Transportation Commission is the decision-making body on our STIP kind of broad categories. Next slide. You've already seen this. Next slide. So we also worked with our advisory committees to develop sub-allocations. So this is our division manages 3 pretty well-established advisory committees. So the Transportation Commission identified kind of those broad categories and dedicated $255 million to our programs. However, staff made a recommendation on what the sub-allocations can be. And so the sub-allocation recommendations came out of a discussion with our advisory committee members, and that was a really, really important piece of this, to say, like, to get their support for putting a little money here, a little money here, a little money here. And we also took all of the feedback that had come to the Transportation Commission, the needs of our modal plans, our strategic action plan, and the consideration of staff capacity, because that's the biggest challenge we're running into is a historic increase in funding with no additional staff. So we've got to reprioritize some staffing. Next slide. And so just going to quickly hit on the categories of where we're putting that $255 million. So for bicycle and pedestrian funding, we are spending about half of that money on the state system and half of that money on the local system through a competitive grant program. Next slide. Oh, and then we also have the Safe Routes to School funding. And I'd like to make the point that with our pedestrian and bicycle and the Safe Routes to School funding, we're using a prioritization system that focuses on equity and access to transit, and being guided by those policy plans as well. Next slide. And then we had our significant increase in our public transportation funding, as you can see. Like we have a state set aside for a mass transit that we then increased to 12 million, increased our elderly and disabled, and then this transit vehicle replacement at 15 million, going from 0 to 15 million. We're focusing that funds as a grant program for low, no, and zero emission vehicles. Next slide. And then transportation options is a place that I think is a really fantastic intersection for active transportation and public transportation, and also a focus on carpooling as well. So this is a program in an effort to reduce those single occupancy vehicle trips. It's the marketing and education component. And the reason why there's such a big increase here is because as part of the executive order, we're looking at a statewide eco rule. So basically employers across the state focusing on an SOV reduction effort with their employees. Next slide. We also had a little bit of passenger rail funding in there for some planning and development of some facilities. Next slide. So just wanted to let you guys know kind of what's on our list for next up. We're doing an equity review of our investment programs. So before we start distributing this money out, we're taking a look at how and where we've been spending our grant program funding, and if we can adjust to better support communities with the greatest need. We're also doing a multimodal network prioritization effort. And so this is some of the more nuts and bolts in terms of the multimodal planning piece. But we're looking at that effort to identify some of those critical priorities, mostly for the next round of our STIP for 27 to 30, so we can go back with a demonstration of need. And then we are developing our programs, including policies around equity and greenhouse gas reduction, access to transit, and then undertaking a public engagement effort. So I was a little over my 10 minutes, Richard, but I think I got it in under 13. So, and again, thank you so much. My name is Susan Pfeifman. I am the Strategic Investments Manager in the Public Transportation Division at the Oregon Department of Transportation. So if anyone's got any questions for me later after the presentation, just let me know. I've got my email there.
I think we have time for a question or two.
Okay.
The first, Pant, I think you're well versed in turning on your mic and opening up your camera. How about you ask the first question since you put it in the chat?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Susan, for your excellent presentation. I just, in your presentation, you discussed about, or you told us that there was a VMT reduction goal per capita. Can you elaborate on that?
I can't tell you what the actual like targets are. That's more information coming out of our climate office. I can tell you that we do have targets that we're supposed to hit, and I can direct you toward our climate office to give you those specifics.
Thank you. If I can find, get any a document or anything on that,
Yeah.
that would be really useful for us. We are working on
No.
our update of our statewide transportation plan. Thank you.
Yeah.
Product her, like I said, her presentation will be included on our website. Her contact information will be there. Definitely feel free to reach out to her.
And I will put, actually, I know which documents could be helpful for you, or I think I know which documents, so I'll put those in the chat for you. The link to them.
Thank you.
Wiley.
Anyone else? Any more questions for Susan? Okay. Seeing none, then we'll move on to Lisa.
Well, good day, everybody. I'm Lisa Redunz. I'm the Principal Transit Planner at the Minnesota Department of Transportation in the Office of Transit and Active Transportation. And I've come prepared to talk a little bit about the statewide transit strategic plan that we are about to undertake, as well as what we're doing with the short-term or 5-year transit plans for our 5311 systems today. Next slide, please. So MnDOT has a long-range planning document called the Minnesota Go 50-Year Vision. This is the master planning document for our agency and for the state. It describes all of the things that MnDOT offers in terms of planning and investment for all modes within the state. And it is the overarching plan that we all the modes adhere to in terms of themes, goals, and strategies. It feeds into the statewide multimodal transportation plan, which it covers all of the modes and how we are going to achieve the goals that have been set forth in the Minnesota Go plan on a 20-year cycle. And then we have individual modal plans you can see on the chart, starting on the far left, the Greater Minnesota Transit Investment Plan, which is a plan that really guides where investments on the state level go for all different types of transit in Greater Minnesota, excluding the Twin Cities area, which is covered under the Regional Metropolitan Planning Organization system. We also cover the pedestrian plan, the bicycle plan, and we do safe routes to school planning in our unit. That's not listed here as a plan under the modal plan systems, but it's incorporated within the pedestrian plan outcomes, as you see. And there's just 2 bars I want to point out on this slide. The first 5 plans on the left of the screen are also included in the statewide highway investment plan process at MnDOT. And then the last 5 on the right are covered under the statewide freight system plan. So transit, pedestrian, bicycle pretty much are covered within the state highway investment plan, but have separate strategies. And I'm here today to talk about the Greater Minnesota Transit Investment Plan and what's coming down the pike. Next slide, please. So we're going to change the name of the Greater Minnesota Transit Investment Plan. It last was published as a 20-year plan update in 2017. We are transitioning to something that's broader that will include both policy and strategic planning and include the investment piece. And right now the working title is the Statewide Transit Strategic Plan. So what is it? It is the modal specific part of MnDOT's agency-wide family of plans for transit. It ensures that we carry out agency goals and objectives in policy, planning, and operations across Greater Minnesota. It provides good coordination and input with all of our stakeholders, including the regional development commissions, regional development organizations, metropolitan planning organizations, including the Twin Cities, coordinating councils, tribal nations, the Public Transit Association, local communities, and transit advisory committees. It also has a large public participation process built into it that comes with input from everyday citizens in Minnesota to talk about what's important to them. So we're looking to create a vision for Greater Minnesota transit delivery and connectivity with this plan. We're going to be identifying collective investment priorities and investment needs. We also are going to be looking to establish performance measures for our transit systems in Greater Minnesota, and then to define strategies and opportunities for intermodal connections in Greater Minnesota. And this last bullet, that really doesn't get addressed elsewhere in the existing plans. So this is something that we're really moving into to try to identify intermodal network facilities, hubs, connection points throughout Greater Minnesota moving forward. Next slide, please. So the plan elements that we are going to be undertaking are the same as what normal other multimodal plans do, which is developing a vision statement, goals, objectives for Greater Minnesota Transit, looking at demographics, trends, reviewing current services, capital gaps, system needs, funding requirements, considering new and emerging technologies to improve system performance and addressing customer needs. Obviously, large public engagement process and outreach with both our partners as well as with the general public, policy and strategy identification and policy analysis as it relates to the agency goals, which are under revision right now, but at this time and moving into the future, they're going to include equity, safety, and accessibility, as well as probably greenhouse gas reduction, as the last speaker talked about. And also I'm throwing in the idea of putting connectivity in as an agency goal, at least in the transit plan. Next slide. So we are starting this process now. Originally, it was to begin last year, but because of the COVID-19 crisis, it did not start. So we're starting early this year in the next month or two to develop a scope of work, get some partner input on what that scope is and requirements. We are going to be hiring a consultant between mid and late 2021 to help us with this work, get under contract, issue the RFP to get them on board. In early 2022, the actual work is underway. We're going to be hopefully doing a large stakeholder engagement process. We want to get out there. Right now, we're prohibited from travel within Minnesota because of COVID, but we are hoping that we'll be able to get out and really get engagement and actual planning help from stakeholders and partners in the process. And we'll be having a technical advisory committee that helps us review and plan for the elements of it. In 2022, we're also going to be looking at technical plan development and then the outreach and stakeholder review and comment at the end of the year. And then we're hoping to get it through internal agency review, public comment period, and plan approval by mid 2023. So the estimated timeline for completion on this process is about 12 to 14 months total. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting elements that plays into this strategic plan is the status of the 5311 systems in Minnesota. We have about 30 of them, and what they've been asked to do through a process called the 5-year plan. And about a decade or so ago, the Minnesota State Legislature created legislation which requires MnDOT to develop a transit investment plan that has a goal of meeting at least 80% of total transit service needs in greater Minnesota by July 1st of 2015, and meeting at least 90% of total transit service needs in greater Minnesota by July 1st, 2025. And when I came on board at MnDOT last fall, my first question was, how do we define what 90% of transit needs are in greater Minnesota? Is that geographic based? Is it based on population? How are we defining this? And the answer was, we're not sure. But we do need to complete a 5-year plan process with the 5311 systems, many of whom are small and rural, in order to help bring them along over a 5-year period in terms of developing their local plan for their system, their ability to financially partner with MnDOT in doing local share matching for their capital needs, for their facilities, and also for new service planning. So we've got a process that began back in 2018, and we hired about 5 consultants, and I can go to the next slide, please. I can show you what that is. So in August 2019, each of the 5311 systems completed a 5-year planning process individually that defined their short-term plans through 2025, identified their funding priorities and sources, and talked about new services they wanted to operate. We had 5 geographic areas of the state defined, and a consultant was hired for each of those 5 areas to work individually with each system and provide technical assistance and plan development. There was a wide variety of individual system needs and desires, as you can imagine, given the differences in these smaller programs by geography, by the type of service that is operated, by the ability for them to provide local matches. They are all in different stages of implementation at this time. Their funding sources might have changed quite a bit in some cases due to what's gone on the last year or two. And their long and short-term needs are also kind of a moving target at this time because of what's happened since those plans were published. Because of COVID, some of the impacts that have happened to our systems have forced them to either pause their efforts to continue with implementing those local plans, or they've begun to move forward and make changes to service, changes to capital requests and facility requests without necessarily updating their plans yet. They've done this in response to the coronavirus issue and to the changes in operations. So we are in the process now of going back and meeting with each of the 30 systems. That's what I've been doing since December of last year, to identify where they're at now, what's changed in their plans, what's going forward, what can they expect to see moving forward, ridership and other impacts to their systems. So where we go from here to achieve the goals they stated in 2019 by 2025 is a huge question. Next slide. So I've been conducting listening sessions with each of the systems. They're generally 2 to 3 hours in length to identify where they're at today, what are their needs today, if any, where are they moving forward based on what was written in their 5-year plans, where are their concerns, what are the constraints for fiscal, for service, for technology, for facility. I am taking those systems individually, then putting together a set of recommendations for our office to look at common themes for implementation assistance for those programs. What do they need? What are the tools for implementation that we can help them with over the next several years to achieve within that original 5-year timeline by 2025? when we go back to the legislature and report what happened. We've got technical assistance that is provided by our staff at the Office of Transit and Active Transportation on the operational, the policy, and the technical side. We have planning assistance, we have training assistance provided by our partners and by our agency. We are looking at scenario development, actually taking what systems are going through today and working through those problems as a training exercise. And we are doing a lot of mentoring. In some cases, we're suggesting service changes that haven't been thought of before based on the current conditions and what is going on in their systems today. We are considering any updates or amendments in this process as noted on an annual basis between now and 2025, so that this is a living document and it serves as a historical reference to what has happened to these systems in the past 5 years and how it has affected them. And we are hoping to develop a web-based planning and implementation tool, including a dashboard, to be used for guidance and measuring progress with these systems. That's a bit off right now. We've got several other things underway, including a statewide technology study for these systems, and also developing some other things as they relate to electronic fare boxes and electronic fare payment systems. Next slide. So some of the already identified needs that have come out from these listening sessions from the systems as I've talked with them is the option to acquire smaller accessible vans and vehicles into their fleets. Currently, we do not do that at this time using any state money for that. It's an interesting thought because at this point, everybody wants to space out in vehicles, not get in smaller vehicles, but in some of the markets in Minnesota, we have very low density and drivers are difficult to find. So being able to use a smaller vehicle that doesn't require a CDL driver is something that they're interested in. A big one is marketing assistance, website development, social media assistance for individual systems. We have just hired someone in our unit to look at a statewide marketing plan to help the systems collectively and individually, and she's just coming on board. Technology identification, what are they using for dispatching routing systems? Where do they need additional help? What kind of selection process should a small system go about looking at in order to find technology that might work for them? There's no one size fits all. So we do have a study going on in that area now and hoping to give them some guidance in how to pick the right technology and also some funding for that. We're looking at what they charge for fares locally and what kind of guidance they need in setting fares or changing fares. Many of the systems have not been charging fares in the last year or so and are not charging through the end of this year. So we need to sort of look at that and how that's going to affect their local share moving forward. And then we are doing much more planning assistance help with them, including identifying and quantifying what unmet demands might be on the local level. We are looking at driver recruitment, training, CDL, passenger endorsement issues for these systems. In Minnesota, a lot of our licensing and training areas have been shut down because of the pandemic in greater Minnesota, and systems do not find it easy to be able to get their drivers endorsed with CDLs or passenger certification right now. So that becomes an issue for them. And then a very large issue is the systems that do operate volunteer drivers, which take people outside of their service area to medical facilities and to other places. They've experienced a great loss in the number of available volunteer drivers. Many of our volunteer drivers are elderly people and they drive their own vehicles, and they have decided not to do so during the pandemic for safety issues, safety reasons. And we're starting to lose that thread. and we don't see a lot of volunteers stepping up who can take that over. So succession planning, looking at ways to provide that option, maybe more inner city or more regional connections are going to be necessary in the future. Next slide. So this is a fuzzy snapshot, and I apologize for that, but this just gives you a sense of how many systems we have in Minnesota. Everything but the white areas on this map, all the colored areas are individual transit systems. And we have a lot of differences. If you look in the upper right corner, the northeast side of our state, we've got one very large system that covers lots of territory. It's not dense in many parts, and we've got other systems doing other things. And really, it is about accessibility and connectivity. How can we get people from one point to another? We've had some major impacts for some of our smaller communities in the state throughout this COVID crisis. We are losing some Main Street communities in rural areas. Businesses are closing down, medical, dental services are moving or closing down. And what we're left with are people who need access to those services. They're not necessarily within the current system boundaries that they live in. We are going to have to take a look at how we plug those holes. So this just gives you an idea, and it's probably not dissimilar from what your states have as well in greater rural areas of the state. So I appreciate this time with you. I wanted to find a slide of a bus leaving, which I finally hunted one down in summer, which is even better because that's when it's nice here. So please enjoy that. And I certainly would be happy to take questions as much as I can actually answer some of them, having only been here for about 5 or 6 months so far. But feel free to contact me. Again, I'm Lisa Reduns, Principal Transit Planner, MnDOT Office of Transit and Active Transportation. Thank you.
Riley, I see we have a question in the chat from Kristen Haar of Iowa. You're not shy. Kristen, go ahead.
Should I comb to my hair? Lisa, thank you. Good to see a neighbor state up there. So you mentioned on one of your slides that you had set a goal of the transit needs or the transit system meeting 80% of the transit needs by, was it 2025?
2015.
Oh, 2015?
Yes, this was legislation. It wasn't our goal. It was mandated in legislation.
And then 90% by 2025?
Right.
So how were those initial needs
quantified?
Yeah, how was that initial measurement done so that you know you're actually working toward that?
I don't unfortunately have an answer for that, Kristen. That was well before I got to MnDOT. There is nothing that quantifies what 80% of the need was in 2015. So where we're at today is measuring span of service, measuring coverage geographically within all of our counties. We're trying to measure new service starts, but we don't have a clear goal yet of what 90% means. And this is a goal, it is not a mandate. It was stated in the legislation as a goal. So what I'm trying to do right now is backtrack a bit and quantify where we're at today, quantify how it differed from what happened prior to COVID, so we can assess what that change might have been in terms of service delivery and needs, and then move forward in the next 3 to 4 years aggressively by 2025 to actually implement things that are important. And I can tell you that the things that are really coming out, well, service is a big question for our systems. Where do we go from here? What are we going to be doing? Nobody really knows that quite yet. We don't know what demand's going to be yet, but I do think the investments that we're starting to look at are in technology and in facilities. And the technology is important because it will bring in some needed enhancements into these systems' hands in terms of managing their programs. Facilities, it's important in Minnesota and in other northern states where we don't have indoor bus parking available in many areas. And, you know, electric vehicles are a wonderful idea and people have been thinking about those too, but unless you have a place to plug them in, unless it's indoors in the winter in our climate, it becomes very difficult. So moving to all of that, I think those are going to be the areas that we can really actually do something with in the next several years. And whether that answers that question for the legislature, I can't predict that now. I can only say that's the best we're going to be able to do in the short term.
Sure, sure. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Wiley, there was another question from Susan Bowe in the chat. Susan?
Oh, hi. Thank you. I'm Susan Bowe from Washington State Department of Transportation, Public Transportation Division. And Lisa, I was just curious, when you went over the different modal plans, you showed that there were, maybe 8 plans, but there's 2 umbrella plans. So does your agency write just 2 plans, or do those 2 umbrella plans reference other plans that are written? We're always struggling with how to write information because we have different audiences that review plans. And so we end up with so many different plans, and it's always a struggle coordinating them.
Yeah, I hear that. No, every one of the 8 modalities that were listed on that slide creates their own plan. And we actually have an oversight committee made up of agency staff that reviews each of those plans prior to approving them to go out to the public. So they all feed from those 2 overriding plans. Does that answer your question, Susan? Hope it does.
Sorry, I was taking some notes. So you have different, is it divisions in your agency that are responsible for each plan?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
and then you have, sorry, it was a different office that makes sure to incorporate those, what's written in those plans into a larger plan?
Yes, we have a overriding planning division at MnDOT, and we all report up through that division.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Okay. Lisa, thank you for your presentation. There's a wealth of information in there that should be usable by everyone. Now we'll go to Grant, and Grant, you'll have our final leg of this part of the program for today.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon to most of you, and maybe good morning to some of you. My name is Grant Sparks, and as Wiley mentioned, I'm the manager of transit planning and corridor development for the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. My background is in federal grant management, transit service planning, and transit capital planning. I started off working for a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., but spent the last 7 years working in the public transit planning space at both the local and state levels. So today I'll be presenting on the Commonwealth of Virginia's approach to statewide multimodal planning and programming. Next slide. So first, just a very quick overview of what I will be covering today. The bulk of the content will focus on the multimodal planning process specific to Virginia, which includes 4 key components: the multimodal transportation plan, multimodal project pipeline, our performance-based funding programs, and then performance measurement. And then I'll close out by briefly describing how we program projects and funding in Virginia, which I believe is fairly unique. And it includes the development of not only the TIP and the STIP, but also a 6-year improvement plan, which is the foundation for both the TIP and the STIP. Next slide. So one quick theme to point out before I dive in, Virginia's transportation policies and procedures require multimodal planning and programming. So it is firmly baked into how we do business and how we make transportation funding decisions. So as you can see on the slide, all steps in the planning process function in a multimodal manner. Just to describe this four-step process in a little more detail, the basis of multimodal planning, all multimodal planning in the Commonwealth, centers around our multimodal transportation plan, known as VTrans, which is updated every 4 years and analyzes the current conditions of our multimodal transportation networks and identifies key needs throughout the state. The second step in the process involves the prioritization of those needs identified in VTrans, which then feeds into what we call a multimodal project pipeline, which is essentially a process for matching available planning resources and funds with the most critical needs. This is a new step in the process, so the details are literally being determined as we speak, but we do see it as a way to tie investments and planning studies with the needs identified in VTrans. The third step in the process is to identify solutions to those needs. So this is project concept development, and then fund solutions that provide the greatest return on investment. And then finally, we have the performance measures through a number of benchmarking activities. And then to complete the circle, all of the data and key performance indicators used to analyze the effectiveness of those state-funded projects then ties right back into the next update of VTrans. I should also mention that this process is not administered by DRPT. It's administered by the Virginia Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment. But we, DRPT, VDOT, the Port Authority, and all the other transportation agencies in the Commonwealth are very much engaged in this process, and we also have specific responsibilities as well. Next slide. To provide a little more detail on the multimodal transportation plan, VTrans is a long-range plan that establishes statewide goals, objectives, and investment priorities. The VTrans development process was initially established to meet both federal and state planning requirements. And as I mentioned on the last slide, it's developed by the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment with input from DRPT, VDOT, and other stakeholders. But in terms of key outputs, the primary product of VTrans is the development of specific midterm and long-term needs, which are multimodal. So they include roadway needs, transit needs, rail, freight, bike, ped, TDM, even port facility needs. So because of the scale of this needs assessment that's developed in VTrans, the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment uses a data-driven approach to needs identification, but then they ground truth those needs through a series of outreach activities, including focus groups, stakeholder meetings, they do surveys, and then they have, I'll show you a screenshot here in a couple slides, they have a really cool interactive map, which they push out. And so they use all those types of tools and outreach strategies. And then additionally, they also have meetings and invite transit agencies and other interest groups to just engage them in the process as well. Next slide. So this may be a little hard to see, but it shows the overarching goals and objectives identified in the last VTrans update. Probably not many surprises on this list, but I did highlight in the blue boxes that transit is specifically called out on 2 of the VTrans objectives. One having to do with accessibility to jobs via all modes, including transit, and then another having to do with the state of good repair for transit vehicles and facilities. Next slide. So I mentioned this interactive map that we used during the VTrans outreach process. This is a screenshot of the map, but it doesn't really do a justice. This map has a lot of data behind it, and it essentially captures all the work that we did during the VTrans development process. Just to quickly describe what you're seeing, each of the pink and purple, and you might even be able to see a few green dots. Those dots on the map represent a need in point format, and then each of the blue lines represents a need in segment format. So as you may be able to tell, there are thousands of needs on this map. And the tool has the capability of filtering these needs by jurisdiction and by mode, but it also has a public comment feature that allows the general public and stakeholders to pin comments directly to this map. So again, this doesn't do it justice. If you are interested in seeing what's in this map, you can go to vtrans.org, and then there's a link to the Interact VTrans map. Next slide. So getting back to the needs, once we have this wide distribution of multimodal needs identified, the next step in the process is to prioritize those needs and then develop the studies that identify potential projects and solutions to address those needs. So the multimodal project pipeline process, again, it's still under development, but it's been described as something similar to a vehicle diagnostic check. So for example, say a check engine light comes on your car or your bus. Not many people go straight to the dealership or the bus manufacturer to get a new vehicle. The logical thing to do is to let the mechanics take a look at the vehicle, run a diagnostic test, and come up with a range of potential solutions with different costs and benefits. So some solutions may be cheap, but could be a short-term fix, while others may be more expensive, but address the issue for a much longer time frame. On the highway side, in Virginia, our friends at VDOT may have a knee-jerk reaction to expanding a roadway if a problem arises, but in many cases, there may be a more cost-effective and practical solution to addressing that problem, which could involve improvements to alternative modes of transportation, such as transit, bike, ped, or anything else. So Project Pipeline is intended to do just that. Basically, it zeroes in on these highest priority needs, and it runs a multimodal diagnostic check to see what the range of solutions are. I think the hope of this piece of the process is to make a critical tie between our performance-based planning efforts established in VTrans with our project programming process. Next slide. And then similar to VTrans, we also have an interactive map that we developed for project prioritization. This is a screenshot of that. Should also mention that only the top 1% of needs are classified as priority 1 needs. And those priority 1 needs will be the needs that will be fed into this project pipeline, which will we will likely develop additional studies to look at potential solutions for. Next slide. So the third step in the process is the development and implementation of multimodal funding programs. One of the Commonwealth's largest transportation funding programs is known as SmartScale, which is a multimodal program. It funds capacity expansion projects for roadway, bike ped, transit, TDM, and rail. And it provides close to $1 billion in project funding every other year. So consistent with the other steps in the planning process, in order to qualify for SmartScale funding, applicants must demonstrate that their proposed project addresses a specific need identified in VTrans. So we receive hundreds of SmartScale applications every 2 years. And the first thing that we do in the project screening is to check to see whether or not it meets a VTrans need. Once an application passes that screening and is deemed as both eligible and ready, the scoring of that project can begin, which is quite data intensive and focuses on these 6 primary factor areas, being congestion mitigation, safety, accessibility, environmental quality, economic development, and land use. Next slide. So with guidance from the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, there's a very large team of data analysts and scorers who work on Smart Scale, including myself and DRPT staff, VDOT staff, and a handful of consultants. Each project receives a score or benefit rating, I guess, within those 6 factor areas. And then the final Smart Scale scores are calculated based on a benefit to cost ratio. So because of this ratio, many transit, bike, ped, and TDM projects do very well in this program. And that's because, generally speaking, they cost less than many roadway projects. So the table on this screen shows the distribution between funded projects by mode through each of the first 3 rounds of Smart Scale. And as you may be able to see, it's a little small, but the non-highway projects have steadily taken a greater share of the Smart Scale funding pot over those first 3 rounds. We are finishing up round 4 of Smart Scale right now. And I will tell you that the trend continues to show an increase in that share, that expanded share of non-roadway projects, which is great. I also wanted to mention that the Smart Scale scoring process is also used to help prioritize projects in other funding programs, such as our interstate corridor improvement plans, where basically we developed projects and a funding plan for a number of key interstate corridors in Virginia, and evaluated solutions using that Smart Scale process. And just like with regular Smart Scale, non-roadway solutions scored very well. And then we also mirror the Smart Scale scoring process in our own DRPT Transit Capital Funding Program when evaluating major expansion projects. Next slide. Last but not least, the 4th step in the process is to analyze key performance indicators to see if the solutions funded through Smart Scale and these other state programs have helped address those needs in VTrans. So using the goals and objectives from VTrans, the Commonwealth has identified a suite of 39 state and federally required multimodal performance measures, and we regularly update those measures. Data and trends identified during this step are then, as I mentioned earlier, it's a cycle. Those data and trends are used to inform the development of the next VTrans update. Next slide. And then like the other steps, we do have a public website or tool which shows the progress of all Smart Scale funded projects. It's actually a dashboard. And additionally, the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment is working on a multimodal data sharing platform to bring those 39 state and federally required performance measures into an easily accessible public-facing website. So we're looking forward to seeing that. I've been told that the beta site should be ready here this summer. So we've been working hard on that. Next slide. And then just I know we're kind of short on time, but to close us out, I talked about the Virginia multimodal performance-based planning process, but I also wanted to quickly explain the Commonwealth's process for project programming. Like all states, our MPOs develop their transportation improvement programs or TIPs, and then the State Transportation Improvement Program or STIP consolidates all of that information from the TIPs into one single document. In Virginia, however, on an annual basis, the Commonwealth Transportation Board approves the allocation of state and federal funds to agencies and projects through the development of this 6-year improvement program, or what we call the SIP. The Department of Taxation, they provide revenue estimates to the various state transportation agencies each year. And then DRPT, VDOT, and these other agencies then match those revenues with their prioritized project list to determine allocations. The SIP then becomes a comprehensive document that outlines planned spending for multimodal transportation projects proposed for construction over the next 6 years, with the first year of the SIP having real allocated funds and the remaining 5 years of the plan, including estimated revenues and spending. So to give you all an idea of the scale of our SIP, I believe the last SIP, so the FY21 SIP, included close to $40 billion in funding for projects. So it's a 6-year plan. That's not all in 1 year, but it's a pretty giant document and very comprehensive. And then last but not least, just in terms of explaining the timing of these documents, it's a little confusing to keep up with all these acronyms and how they relate to one another. But the SIP is developed and approved prior to the beginning of the state fiscal year, which begins on July 1st. So when the Commonwealth Transportation Board takes action on the SIP prior to July 1, it essentially authorizes the funding that is then used by MPOs, localities, transit agencies, and others to be programmed in the TIP and eventually the STIP. So it's really the first piece of the process when developing the TIP and STIP documents, which I think is a little unique to Virginia. I know that was a lot in a very short amount of time, so I apologize for trying to speed through it, but that concludes my presentation.
Okay. Richard, did you see any questions that we need to address?
I did. Actually, Grant, would you check the chat? There's actually a specific question and a request for documents. So it's focused just directly on a specific thing from Pratap and of Hawaii. So I'm going to shift the slide, and it's time for discussion. It's time for Q&A. Feel free to raise your hand, or just seriously, just open up, turn on your mic, turn on your camera, or use the chat. Let us know if there's any questions that you'd like to ask. Checking the chat right now.
And Richard, I'll follow up directly with the questions asked.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, there's the one regarding from Pratap about your smart scale and 39 performance measures. Do they cover FHWA and FDA requirements? And also, could you send the lists and documents? So
yeah, I'll follow up.
That'd be great.
Richard, I'll go back to one of Lisa's areas where she spoke on the environmental portion of her presentation, and I want to find out, are they using CMAX funds in order to address the climate plans they're working on? She's not mute.
Lisa,
You're on mute. You're on mute.
there you go.
That might have been Susan's presentation.
Pardon me.
I don't think it was mine.
Okay,
Susan?
Our CMAQ dollars are distributed as a direct allocation to our CMAQ target areas. So there are the Portland metro area, for example, has had greenhouse gas targets for probably about 10 years now, as required by law. And so they do use a significant amount of their CMAQ dollars in order to help achieve some of those targets. And specifically, they've been using those funds for some light rail expansion over the last 10 years.
Okay. Anyone else? Any other
Questions?
questions?
All right, now for all the folks who are still left, last chat. What else? What do you got there? I know that you've heard our first MTAP Technical Initiatives Forum. Send me ideas in the chat. I assume what other ideas, what other things would people like to hear about as we move forward in this year? So we have the first forum, and we can do as many forums as the membership would like. So if you have a chat or you have a moment, send me a chat. Let me know what else you'd like to hear. Everyone was really good at the first chat, so I hope the second chat will, or the last chat will be equally as well. Also, for everybody online with us, please save the date, April 15th from 11:30 to 1. The Council on Public Transportation and MTAP hosting a joint online forum on states coordinating transit access for COVID-19 vaccinations. Stay tuned. We've already sent out a calendar invite on this, and we will be distributing an agenda as well as a registration. So stay tuned. Let me know if you haven't received that. Again, put your name in the chat, and I'm glad to add you to that calendar invite list to get you registered for this particular session. And last but not least, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's MTAP Technical Initiatives Forum. My contact information is below. I hope you have a great day, and thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thank you to our panelists. I think it was a very productive conversation, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for the opportunity, Richard. Also.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.